The investment man. That's him. Damien pointed so enthusiastically that Daisy immediately grabbed his arm. Pointing is rude. But that's him. Who? The investment man. Daisy blinked. The what? Before she could ask another question, Damien had already started moving. Fast. Very fast. Too fast. Damien. The little boy ignored her completely. Naturally. Daisy immediately started after him. Daniel sighed. Diana followed. The teacher looked alarmed. And somewhere across the gymnasium, Anthony Green was having a perfectly normal conversation. For about 5 more seconds. And we'd like to thank Green Holdings for its continued support. Anthony nodded politely. The principal continued speaking. Something about future programs. Something about scholarships. Something about expansion. Anthony wasn't really listening. Years of corporate meetings had taught him how to look attentive while mentally being somewhere else. Then a familiar voice interrupted. Investment men. Anthony froze. Not again. He looked down. And immediately recognized the tiny troublemaker. Damien Hart. The little businessman. The future financial menace. Anthony found himself smiling before he could stop it. Damien. The boy looked pleased. Very pleased. You remembered. I remember people who try to sell me things. The principal looked confused. The teachers looked confused. Several parents looked confused. Damien looked proud. As though this was a compliment. Which, unfortunately, it probably was. By the time Daisy arrived, Damien was already talking. A lot. And then the principal said I couldn't charge playground fees. Anthony laughed. Actually laughed. Again. Daisy couldn't remember the last time she'd seen a stranger take such an immediate liking to Damien. Most people needed time. Several years, usually. Damien. The little boy finally looked guilty. Slightly. Sorry, Mom. Not sorry. At all. Anthony noticed immediately. The corner of his mouth twitched. Dangerous. Very dangerous. Because Damien had apparently found another adult willing to encourage his nonsense. Mr. Green. Daisy extended her hand politely. Anthony accepted it. The moment their hands touched, something strange happened. Nothing dramatic. Nothing magical. Just a brief sense of familiarity. As though they had crossed paths before. Somewhere. Somehow. Both dismissed the feeling immediately. Neither had time to think about it. Because Damien was still talking. And if people invested early enough. No. Damien looked offended. I wasn't even finished. I know. The boy sighed dramatically. Anthony almost laughed again. The child was unbelievable. Nearby, Daniel watched quietly. Observing. Studying. Analyzing. Something Daisy often forgot was that Daniel noticed everything. Everything. The little boy looked from Anthony. To Damien. Back to Anthony. Then frowned. His expression becoming thoughtful. Very thoughtful. The kind of thoughtful that usually preceded difficult questions. Daisy immediately became nervous. Because Daniel's questions were dangerous. Unlike Damien, who spoke first and thought later. Daniel thought first. A lot. Then asked things nobody wanted to answer. Meanwhile, Diana stood beside Anthony. Completely comfortable. Which was unusual. Normally she was shy around strangers. Today she wasn't. The little girl looked up. Studying him. Then smiled. A sweet. Gentle. Heart-melting smile. Anthony felt something shift inside him. Again. That strange warmth. The one he'd experienced during the charity event. Only stronger this time. Much stronger. Hi. Diana's voice was soft. Anthony smiled. Hi. The little girl held up a handmade Father's Day card. Anthony glanced at it. Then froze. The colorful paper showed a smiling stick figure family. A mother. 3 children. And an empty space. A blank space where another figure should have been. His chest tightened unexpectedly. Did you make that? Diana nodded. Everyone else made one too. The sadness in her voice was subtle. But it was there. Anthony felt it immediately. The emotion hit harder than it should have. Far harder. Because for some reason, he hated seeing disappointment in her eyes. Across the gym, the event finally began. Parents took their seats. Children gathered nearby. Laughter filled the room. Excitement spread everywhere. Everywhere except one corner. Where 3 little siblings sat quietly. Watching. Waiting. Trying not to feel different. Anthony noticed. He couldn't help noticing. The triplets smiled. They participated. They laughed. But something felt missing. Something obvious. Something painful. Then he remembered. Father's Day. Understanding settled heavily inside his chest. And suddenly the empty chair beside the triplets seemed impossible to ignore. The principal stepped onto the stage. Microphone in hand. Ready to begin. Anthony should have been paying attention. Instead, his gaze drifted back toward the children. Toward Daniel. Toward Diana. Toward Damien. Toward the empty chair beside them. A chair that should have belonged to someone. A chair that, for reasons he couldn't explain, made his chest ache. And for the first time in many years, Anthony Green found himself wishing he could do something about it. The empty chair. Anthony tried to focus on the event. He really did. The principal was giving a speech. Parents were applauding. Children were laughing. Everything appeared normal. Yet his attention kept drifting. Back to the same place. Back to the same 3 children. Back to the same empty chair. It was ridiculous. He didn't know them. Didn't owe them anything. Didn't even understand why he cared. Yet every time he looked at them, something tugged inside him. Especially when Diana glanced around the room. Watching fathers sit beside their children. Watching little girls climb into their fathers' laps. Watching boys proudly introduce their dads to friends. The disappointment she tried so hard to hide nearly broke Anthony's heart. The first activity began. Children and fathers were asked to form teams. Excitement exploded throughout the gymnasium. The triplets remained seated. Daniel looked down. Diana smiled bravely. Damien crossed his arms. The little boy looked angry. Not sad. Angry. A very Damien reaction. The teacher approached. Clearly uncomfortable. Daisy. Daisy looked up. The woman lowered her voice. They don't have to participate. The statement hurt. Not because the teacher meant any harm. Because the children heard it. Every word. Every single word. And the disappointment in their eyes was impossible to miss. At that exact moment, Anthony stood. Without thinking. Without planning. Without consulting the logical part of his brain. He simply stood. His grandfather immediately noticed. A slow smile spread across the old man's face. Because he already knew. Anthony, unfortunately, did not. He only knew one thing. Those children looked like they were hurting. And for some reason, he couldn't bear it. The teacher looked surprised when Anthony approached. Mr. Green. Anthony glanced at the triplets. Then at the teacher. Then back at the triplets. The words came out before he could stop them. Would it be all right if I helped? Silence. Complete silence. Several parents turned. The principal froze. Daisy blinked. The teacher stared. Even Anthony was slightly shocked by what he'd just said. Because honestly, what was he doing? Damien recovered first. Immediately. See. Nobody knew what that meant. Including Daisy. But Damien looked victorious. Which was never a good sign. You said he was important. The boy pointed dramatically. Now he's volunteering. Daniel looked embarrassed. Diana looked hopeful. Anthony looked confused. Daisy looked exhausted. Normal Damien behavior. The teacher eventually smiled. I think that would be wonderful. Anthony should have walked away. Politely. Respectfully. Instead he sat down beside the triplets. Right beside the empty chair. The chair nobody had occupied all day. The chair that suddenly didn't seem quite so empty anymore. The first challenge involved building a tower. Simple. Or at least it should have been. Unfortunately, Damien existed. No. Anthony removed 3 blocks. Damien looked offended. Why? Because that's not a tower. It will be. It won't. It might. Anthony stared. The little boy stared back. A battle of stubbornness immediately began. Several minutes later Daniel sighed. Again. The sigh of a child burdened by excessive intelligence. You're both wrong. Anthony blinked. Excuse me. Daniel calmly adjusted the structure. Within seconds the tower stood perfectly balanced. The adults around them applauded. Anthony stared. Impressed. Very impressed. The kid was smart. Dangerously smart. Then there was Diana. The peacekeeper. The diplomat. The heart of the group. Whenever Daniel and Damien argued, she intervened. Whenever someone looked sad, she comforted them. Whenever Anthony struggled to understand what was happening, she explained. Patiently. Kindly. As though she had been doing it for years. Anthony found himself smiling repeatedly. The children were impossible not to love. The realization startled him. Because he had known them for approximately 40 minutes. Across the gym, Daisy watched quietly. Something strange was happening. The children looked comfortable. Natural. Happy. As though Anthony had always been there. And somehow, Anthony looked different too. Lighter. Warmer. More relaxed than she had ever seen him. Even his smile seemed genuine. Not forced. Not polite. Real. The sight made something twist inside her chest. A strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. Because for the first time, she could clearly see what her children had been missing. And what Anthony himself seemed to be missing too. The event ended hours later. Children gathered their belongings. Parents exchanged goodbyes. People slowly began leaving. The triplets stood beside Anthony. None of them seemed eager to say goodbye. Especially Diana. The little girl hesitated. Then held out her Father's Day card. The unfinished one. The one with the empty space. Anthony looked down. Confused. Diana smiled shyly. You can keep it. The gym suddenly felt very quiet. Anthony carefully accepted the card. His throat tightened unexpectedly. Thank you. The little girl hugged him. Without hesitation. Without permission. Without warning. Anthony froze. Completely. For one brief moment, the world seemed to stop. Then he slowly hugged her back. And something inside him cracked. Not painfully. Not completely. Just enough to let a little light through. Enough to make him realize how empty his life had truly been. Enough to make saying goodbye much harder than it should have been. As Daisy led the triplets toward the exit, Damien suddenly turned around. Investment men. Anthony smiled. Yes. The little boy grinned. See you again. Anthony's smile widened. For reasons he couldn't explain. I hope so. And somewhere deep inside, fate smiled too. Because for the first time, Anthony Green had spent a day acting like a father. Without realizing the children he cared about were already his. The card. Anthony should have thrown it away. That was the logical thing to do. The reasonable thing. The normal thing. Yet 3 days later, Diana's Father's Day card still sat on his desk. Right beside several billion-dollar contracts. The contrast was absurd. One document represented millions. The other was construction paper covered in glitter. Guess which one held his attention? You've been staring at that card for 10 minutes. Anthony looked up. His assistant stood in the doorway. Again. Always appearing at the worst possible moments. I haven't. You have. I was thinking. About the card. Anthony sighed. The woman was annoyingly observant. His assistant approached. Carefully inspecting the colorful paper. A smiling stick figure family. A mother. 3 children. An empty space. The empty space bothered him. Far more than it should. You like them? Anthony immediately frowned. They're children. That's not a denial. The assistant smiled. Dangerous. Very dangerous. Anthony ignored her. Unfortunately, his silence was answer enough. Across town, Daniel Hart was conducting an investigation. A serious one. At least by 5-year-old standards. His notebook sat open on the living room floor. Several pages contained observations. Facts. Questions. Evidence. Daisy stared. Concerned. What are you doing? Daniel didn't look up. Research. Never a good answer. What kind of research? The little boy pointed toward the page. Daisy leaned closer. Immediately regretting it. Because the title read. The Investment Men. Oh no. Not this. Not at all. Daniel. He finally looked up. What? Daisy chose her next words carefully. Very carefully. Why are you investigating Mr. Green? Daniel blinked. Then shrugged. Asking questions is important. That sounded suspiciously reasonable. Daisy hated it. What kind of questions? The little boy considered this. Then answered honestly. The normal kind. Which meant absolutely nothing. Later that evening, the triplets sat around the dining table. Homework spread everywhere. Crayons. Pencils. Books. Chaos. Normal family life. Or as close as they could manage. Damien suddenly looked up. Mom. Daisy immediately became suspicious. Experience had taught her this. Yes. When are we seeing the investment men again? There it was. The obsession continued. Daisy sighed. I don't know. Damien looked disappointed. He likes me. Daniel snorted. The sound shocked everyone. Including Daniel. Apparently even he had limits. He likes all of us. Damien folded his arms. Mostly me. No. Yes. No. Yes. The argument escalated immediately. Diana rolled her eyes. A surprisingly sophisticated reaction for a 5-year-old. Then she quietly asked. Do you think he was lonely? The room fell silent. Daisy blinked. What? Diana looked down. Thoughtful. He looked sad sometimes. The statement hit harder than expected. Because Daisy had noticed it too. The smiles. The kindness. The warmth. But underneath all of it, something hurt. She had seen it in his eyes. The kind of loneliness that couldn't be hidden completely. The kind people carried for years. The realization unsettled her. Because she understood loneliness better than most. That same night, Anthony stood on the balcony of his penthouse. The city stretched endlessly below. Lights. Traffic. Life. Yet all he could think about were 3 children. Particularly one stubborn little boy. One thoughtful little boy. And one sweet little girl. The realization was ridiculous. He barely knew them. Yet somehow the penthouse felt even emptier than usual. His phone buzzed. A message from his grandfather. Dinner tomorrow. Don't make excuses. Anthony smiled despite himself. The old man was relentless. Then another message arrived. This one from an unknown number. The smile disappeared. Immediately. Anthony opened it. The message contained only one sentence. If you want the truth about your medical records, stop ignoring the signs. His entire body went still. The city lights blurred. His pulse accelerated. For several seconds he simply stared. Reading the message again. And again. And again. The words made no sense. Yet somehow they terrified him. Because deep down, a part of him had always wondered. Always questioned. Always doubted. What if? What if the diagnosis was wrong? What if something had been missed? What if 15 years of his life had been built on a lie? Anthony looked out at the city. His heart beat loud in his ears. Because for the first time, someone else was asking the same questions. And somewhere nearby, Martha N. George was discovering that the email she had sent weeks earlier had finally reached the right person. The DNA bomb arc was getting closer. And the first crack in the conspiracy had just appeared. The first crack. Anthony didn't sleep. Not after the message. Not after reading those words. Not after spending 3 hours staring at his phone like it contained the answers to every question he'd carried for 15 years. If you want the truth about your medical records, stop ignoring the signs. The message haunted him. Because it touched a wound he never discussed. A wound he barely allowed himself to think about. The diagnosis. The verdict. The sentence that had shaped his entire life. Sterile. The word echoed through his mind. Again. And again. And again. Until dawn finally arrived. By 8 o'clock the following morning, Anthony was sitting in his office. The message displayed on his computer screen. His assistant stood nearby. Concerned. You look terrible. Anthony ignored her. Trace the number. She blinked. The message. Yes. Her concern deepened. What happened? Anthony hesitated. Then handed over the phone. The moment she read the text, her expression changed. Immediately. What does this mean? I don't know. Which was true. And terrifying. Because for years Anthony had accepted the diagnosis. Eventually, grief became routine. Routine became reality. Reality became his life. Now someone was suggesting that reality might be wrong. The possibility frightened him more than he wanted to admit. Across town, Daisy was having a much different morning. Specifically, she was chasing Damien. Again. Get down from there. No. The little boy sat happily atop a bookshelf. Eating cookies. Like a tiny criminal. Daisy pinched the bridge of her nose. Why are you on the bookshelf? Damien shrugged. Perspective. Perspective. Yes. Daniel sighed. The now famous Daniel sigh. The sigh of a child constantly disappointed by humanity. He means he wanted to see farther. Daisy looked at her eldest son. Thank you. You're welcome. Then Daniel returned to reading. As if translating Damien's nonsense was a normal daily responsibility. Which, unfortunately, it was. Later that afternoon, Daniel approached Daisy carrying his notebook. The notebook. The dangerous notebook. Daisy immediately became nervous. Mom. Yes. Daniel climbed onto the couch beside her. His expression serious. Too serious. Can I ask a question? That sentence had never led anywhere good. Not once. Daisy braced herself. Okay. Daniel opened the notebook. Several pages contained observations about Anthony Green. Drawings. Notes. Comments. Research. Far too much research. Daisy stared. Horrified. When did you do all this? The little boy looked confused. During the week. Of course. Naturally. Why play video games when you could conduct investigations? Daniel. Yes. Daisy carefully chose her words. Why are you so interested in Mr. Green? The little boy was silent for a moment. Then he answered. And the answer stole her breath. Because he looks like Damien. The room went completely silent. Daisy froze. Daniel continued. Oblivious. The eyes. Her heart skipped. The smile. Another beat. The stubbornness. A third. And they're both good at business. Daisy stared at him. Speechless. Because for one terrifying second, the thought crossed her mind. Then she immediately pushed it away. Impossible. Completely impossible. Thousands of people shared similar features. Millions. The world wasn't that small. Still. The observation lingered. Uncomfortable. Persistent. Dangerous. That same evening, Martha N. George parked outside Green Holdings headquarters. Her hands trembled against the steering wheel. For weeks she had hidden. Waited. Watched. Gathered evidence. Now she had finally made a decision. No more anonymous messages. No more warnings. No more hints. Anthony Green deserved the truth. All of it. The folder sitting beside her contained everything. The altered records. The hidden reports. The suspicious access logs. The fertility evaluation. Years of deception. Years of lies. Years stolen. Martha stared at the building. Then took a deep breath. And stepped out of the car. Inside Green Holdings, Anthony stood near the window. Lost in thought. The city stretched endlessly below. Yet his attention remained fixed on one question. What if? What if the diagnosis was wrong? What if the message was real? What if his entire life had been built on a lie? A knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in. The door opened. His assistant appeared. Looking unusually pale. Anthony frowned. What is it? She swallowed. Then answered. There's a woman downstairs asking to see you. Anthony sighed. I have meetings. She says it's urgent. Everyone says that. The assistant hesitated. Then added. She said it's about your infertility. The room instantly went silent. Every muscle in Anthony's body locked. His heartbeat accelerated. The city vanished. The office vanished. Everything vanished. Except those words. About your infertility. Slowly. Very slowly. Anthony looked up. For the first time in 15 years, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. Because deep down, he already knew. His life was about to change forever. The truth begins. Anthony Green had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions. He had faced hostile takeovers. Survived boardroom wars. Buried competitors. Built an empire. Yet somehow, the woman sitting across from him made him more nervous than any of those things. Martha N. George looked exhausted. terrified, and completely serious, which immediately concerned him. His assistant had escorted her into a private conference room. Now only the two of them remained. A thick folder sat on the table between them. Anthony's eyes never left it. "You said this is about my infertility." Martha nodded. "Yes." Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Then Anthony asked the question that had haunted him all morning. "Who are you?" "I'm a laboratory technician." His frown deepened. "A technician? At the fertility clinic?" The words instantly captured his attention. Every instinct sharpened. Every sense heightened. Because suddenly the anonymous message made sense. At least partially. What exactly is this about? Martha looked down at the folder. Then back at him. As though deciding how much to reveal. How quickly. How carefully. Finally she spoke. "What I'm about to tell you may be difficult to hear." Anthony almost laughed. His entire life had been difficult to hear. He doubted this could be worse. He was wrong. Martha slowly opened the folder. Several documents slid across the table. Anthony immediately recognized some of them. Medical reports. Hospital records. Fertility assessments. Pieces of a life he had spent years trying to forget. "These belong to you." Anthony nodded. "I know. What you don't know is that some of them shouldn't exist." The room fell silent. His stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Martha handed him another document. An older one. Much older. The paper appeared worn. Archived. Forgotten. Anthony scanned the contents. Then froze. His eyes moved over the page again. And again. And again. The words remained exactly the same. Normal fertility markers. His pulse accelerated. No. That couldn't be right. His gaze jumped to the date. 14 years ago. 1 year before the first diagnosis. 1 year before everything changed. Anthony looked up slowly. "What is this?" Martha swallowed. "The first complete fertility assessment we found." Found. The wording unsettled him. "What do you mean found?" Her expression darkened. "Someone tried very hard to make sure nobody ever saw it." The room became painfully quiet. Anthony stared at her. Unable to speak. Unable to think. Unable to breathe properly. Because for the first time, the impossible seemed possible. No. The word escaped automatically. Martha remained silent. Anthony pushed the document away. "No." His voice became harder. "This has to be a mistake." "I thought so too." "No." Martha waited. Patiently. Carefully. "I checked the records multiple times." Anthony stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor. The sound echoed through the room. His heart hammered violently. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Every doctor. Every hospital. Every specialist. Every test. They couldn't all be wrong. Could they? The question terrified him. Because deep down, a tiny voice whispered something dangerous. What if they weren't wrong? What if they were lying? Martha slid another document across the table. Then another. Then another. Each one more disturbing than the last. Access logs. Archived reports. Deleted records. Unauthorized modifications. Evidence. Pages and pages of evidence. Anthony's hands trembled as he reviewed them. Because a pattern was beginning to emerge. A very ugly pattern. The same facilities. The same names. The same physicians. Repeatedly. Over years. Over many years. His stomach twisted. This doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me either. Martha's voice softened. Until I realized somebody was changing your records. Anthony looked up sharply. The words hit like a physical blow. Changing your records. Not misplacing them. Not misunderstanding them. Changing them. Deliberately. Intentionally. Purposefully. No. His voice cracked. For the first time in years. It actually cracked. Martha looked away briefly. As though giving him privacy. Dignity. Time. Because she understood what he was losing. Or perhaps what he was realizing he had already lost. 15 years. The number echoed through Anthony's mind. 15 years. 15 birthdays. 15 Christmases. 15 years of believing he'd never have children. 15 years of broken relationships. Of loneliness. Of grief. Of acceptance. Of surrender. And now. Someone was suggesting it had all been a lie. His chest tightened painfully. Why? The question came out barely above a whisper. Martha looked at him. Genuine sadness filling her eyes. I don't know. Anthony laughed bitterly. Not because anything was funny. Because he suddenly wanted to break something. Anything. Everything. Someone had stolen years from him. Years he could never recover. Years he could never relive. Years he could never replace. The realization hurt more than the diagnosis ever had. Then Martha reached into the folder one final time. Her hands shook. For the first time since entering the room. Anthony noticed. Whatever she was about to reveal frightened even her. Slowly. Carefully. She placed a single page in front of him. Anthony frowned. What is this? Martha's voice dropped. Almost to a whisper. The reason I started investigating. Anthony looked down. The document contained clinic records. Transfer logs. Donor information. Patient information. At first, nothing stood out. Then he saw his name. Anthony Green. His entire body went still. His heartbeat stopped. Or at least it felt that way. Because beneath his name was another. A woman. A woman he had never met. A woman he had seen only twice. A woman accompanied by 3 children. 3 children he couldn't stop thinking about. 3 children who somehow felt familiar. His eyes widened. Slowly. Dangerously. As he read the name. Daisy Hart. The room spun. The page trembled in his hands. And for the first time, Anthony Green realized the truth might be far bigger than he had ever imagined. The investigation. Anthony Green didn't believe in coincidences. Not anymore. Not after Martha's revelations. Not after the altered records. Not after 15 years of lies. And certainly not after seeing Daisy Hart's name inside clinic documents connected to him. Someone had manipulated his life. The only question now was why. And who? The moment Martha left his office, Anthony ordered a complete investigation. Not through Green Holdings. Not through through people he trusted. Very few people. By midnight, one of the country's best private investigators sat across from him. A thick notebook rested on the table. The investigator listened carefully as Anthony explained everything. The altered records. The fertility clinic. Martha. Daisy Hart. The children. Especially the children. Start with Daisy Hart. The investigator raised an eyebrow. The businesswoman. Yes. Anthony hesitated. Then added. And her children. The investigator's expression became curious. Any particular reason? Anthony stared out the window. Because they won't leave my mind. Because I can't explain why I'm drawn to them. Because every time I see them, something feels familiar. Instead he simply said, I want answers. The investigator nodded. That was enough. The following week passed slowly. Painfully slowly. Anthony buried himself in work. Or at least tried to. Unfortunately, concentration had become impossible. Every report reminded him of Martha. Every meeting reminded him of the lies. Every quiet moment reminded him of the children. Particularly one small troublemaker. Investment men. Anthony smiled despite himself. Then immediately stopped. This was getting ridiculous. Meanwhile, Daisy was enjoying one of the rare peaceful afternoons in her life. The triplets were playing in the garden. Nobody was crying. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was painting animals. It felt suspicious. Very suspicious. Daisy sat on the patio with a cup of coffee. Watching them. Smiling. Moments like this made every struggle worthwhile. Every sleepless night. Every sacrifice. Every battle. Then Damien appeared. Covered in dirt. Naturally. Mom. Daisy narrowed her eyes. What happened? The little boy looked offended. Nothing. The dirt suggested otherwise. Nearby, Daniel and Diana were building something. A cardboard city. Complete with roads. Buildings. Parks. And apparently a bank. Because Damien had insisted. Daniel carefully adjusted one of the structures. The concentration on his face made Daisy smile. He was growing up so quickly. Too quickly. The same was true for all three of them. Sometimes she wished she could freeze time. Just for a little while. Unfortunately, someone else was watching. From a parked vehicle across the street. A man lowered his camera. Then picked up his phone. They're home. The investigator's voice remained calm. Professional. Efficient. Anthony sat in his office listening. What have you found? A brief pause followed. Then. Daisy Hart has 3 children. Anthony closed his eyes. He already knew that. What else? Triplets. His grip tightened around the phone. Again, nothing new. The investigator continued. 5 years old. Anthony went still. 5 years. Exactly 5 years. Around the same time the clinic records indicated an unauthorized procedure. A coincidence? Probably. Yet something about it made his stomach tighten. What are their names? The investigator consulted his notes. Daniel Hart. Anthony listened. Diana Hart. His pulse accelerated slightly. And Damien Hart. The names felt oddly familiar. Though he couldn't explain why. Maybe because he already knew them. Maybe because he'd met them. Maybe because he couldn't stop thinking about them. Then the investigator said something unexpected. There's more. Anthony frowned. What? A pause. Long enough to create tension. Long enough to make him uneasy. The children don't have a father listed anywhere. Silence. Complete silence. Anthony stared at the city beyond his office window. His heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears. No father. None. The investigator sounded equally puzzled. No public records. No. No custody filings. Impossible. No legal disputes. Anthony slowly sat down. Because suddenly. Nothing felt coincidental anymore. Across town, Daniel looked up from his cardboard city. A strange feeling settled over him. The sensation that someone was watching. The sensation that something was changing. He couldn't explain it. Nor could he ignore it. The little boy glanced toward the street. Toward the passing cars. Toward the world beyond their gate. Then frowned. For reasons he couldn't understand. He found himself thinking about Anthony Green. Again. And somewhere across the city, Anthony Green was thinking about him too. Neither understood why. Yet the invisible thread connecting them was growing stronger. Day by day. Question by question. Clue by clue. The truth was getting closer. And once it arrived, nothing would ever be the same. Too many coincidences. Anthony Green hated unanswered questions. That was exactly why he found himself sitting alone in his office at nearly midnight. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. And yet he remained exactly where he was. Studying the file. Again. And again. And again. 5 years old. Triplets. No father listed. Daisy Hart. The fertility clinic. The timing. Every piece seemed harmless on its own. Together, they formed a puzzle. One Anthony couldn't ignore. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in. The private investigator entered carrying another folder. Anthony immediately sat upright. What did you find? The investigator placed the folder on the desk. Information regarding the IVF procedure. Anthony's pulse accelerated. Finally. Answers. Or at least more questions. These days the two seemed interchangeable. The investigator opened the file. Daisy Hart underwent IVF approximately 6 years ago. Anthony nodded. He already knew that much. What else? The investigator hesitated. An unusual reaction. Anthony noticed immediately. What? The men slid several documents across the desk. The donor information is missing. Anthony frowned. Missing. Completely. That made no sense. Every fertility clinic kept records. Detailed records. Extensive records. Especially regarding donors. Anthony looked up. How does a donor file disappear? The investigator's expression darkened. It doesn't. Silence. Heavy. Meaningful silence. Because both men understood the implication. Someone hadn't lost the records. Someone had removed them. Deliberately. Anthony leaned back slowly. His mind racing. The clinic had altered his medical history. The donor information had vanished. The timing matched. The children were the right age. And now. There was no father listed. Coincidences existed. Of course they did. But Anthony had built an empire by recognizing patterns. And this pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Daisy was discovering that raising triplets required supernatural patience. Specifically when Damien decided to become an inventor. Mom. Daisy looked up from her laptop. What exploded? Nothing. Smoke drifted through the backyard window. Daisy stood immediately. Damien. It wasn't technically an explosion. The distinction did not comfort her. At all. She hurried outside. Only to find Daniel holding a garden hose. Diana holding a bucket. And Damien standing proudly beside what appeared to be the remains of a homemade rocket. Oh. Daisy blinked. Then blinked again. Explain. Damien grinned. It almost worked. That evening, after the children were asleep, Daisy found herself standing in the nursery. The room had changed over the years. The cribs were gone. Replaced by books. Photographs. Toys. Memories. 5 years. 5 beautiful years. Sometimes she still couldn't believe how quickly time had passed. Her gaze landed on an old box tucked inside the closet. The IVF box. The one she rarely opened. Slowly she pulled it out. Dust covered the lid. Memories covered everything else. Appointments. Medical forms. Ultrasound images. Hospital bracelets. Fragments of another life. A younger version of herself. A more frightened version. She smiled softly. Then froze. Something was missing. Her frown deepened. She searched again. And again. Then again. No. The donor paperwork. The paperwork she'd been given years ago. The paperwork she'd never really cared about. It wasn't there. Daisy sat back slowly. Confused. She distinctly remembered keeping everything. Every single document. So why was that file gone? Across the city, Anthony's investigator made one final call before midnight. His voice sounded unusually serious. There's something else. Anthony's stomach tightened. What? A pause followed. Then. I spoke with a former clinic employee. Anthony stood immediately. What did they say? The investigator exhaled slowly. As far as she knows. Another pause. Long enough to be painful. There was an incident involving donor samples. Anthony's heart slammed against his ribs. The room suddenly felt smaller. Warmer. Dangerous. What kind of incident? The investigator's answer changed everything. A mix-up. Silence. Complete silence. Anthony stared into the darkness beyond the windows. A mix-up. The words echoed inside his head. Over and over. Because for the first time, a possibility he had refused to consider began taking shape. A terrifying possibility. One capable of changing his entire life. And somewhere across the city, Daisy sat holding an empty file box. Wondering why critical documents had disappeared. Neither of them realized it yet. But the truth was no longer hiding. The walls protecting the conspiracy were beginning to crumble. And once they fell, 3 little lives would become the center of a storm powerful enough to destroy everything built on lies. The boy who looked familiar. Anthony told himself he wasn't following the children. That would have sounded creepy. Possibly illegal. Definitely embarrassing. So when he found himself parked across from the academy on a sunny Thursday afternoon, he chose a different explanation. He was observing. Professionally. Very different. At least that's what he told himself. Unfortunately, even he wasn't convinced. The school's annual family sports day had attracted dozens of parents. Children raced across the field. Teachers shouted instructions. Families filled the stands. Anthony sat inside his vehicle wearing sunglasses. Like a man conducting surveillance. Which, admittedly, he was. The realization annoyed him. A lot. Because none of this made sense. Yet he couldn't stay away. Not after the missing records. Not after the donor mix-up. Not after learning the triplets were the exact age they should have been. Questions demanded answers. And Anthony Green had never been good at ignoring questions. A burst of laughter pulled his attention toward the field. Damien Hart. Naturally. The little boy sprinted across the grass at alarming speed. Ignoring rules. Ignoring instructions. Ignoring basic common sense. Several teachers looked exhausted. Anthony found himself smiling. The child was chaos wrapped in confidence. Then his smile slowly faded. Because Damien had just done something. Something small. Something insignificant. Something terrifying. The little boy pushed his hair back with one hand. A simple gesture. A completely ordinary gesture. Except, Anthony did the exact same thing. The exact same way. The same movement. The same habit. The same unconscious mannerism. His smile disappeared entirely. No. The word escaped quietly. Coincidences. Just coincidences. Nothing more. Children copied behaviors all the time. Even from strangers. Even from television. Even from people they'd met once. The explanation made sense. It should have comforted him. Instead it didn't. Then Daniel appeared. The older boy stood near the sidelines reviewing what appeared to be a score sheet. At 6 years old. Anthony almost laughed. The child looked more like an accountant than a first grader. A teacher approached. Daniel immediately began explaining something. Confidently. Calmly. Logically. The teacher listened. Nodded. Accepted the correction. And walked away. Anthony stared. The boy had just negotiated with an adult. Successfully. Without raising his voice. Without losing composure. Without backing down. A strange chill moved through him. Because that looked familiar too. Dangerously familiar. Meanwhile, Diana sat beneath a tree helping another child tie her shoe. The little girl smiled constantly. Talked constantly. Helped everyone. Even strangers. Anthony watched her comfort a crying classmate. Then share her snack. Then offer a hug. His chest tightened unexpectedly. She was impossible not to adore. A whistle blew. The next event was announced. Parent-child relay race. Children immediately ran toward their families. Excited. Energetic. Happy. The triplets slowed. Just slightly. Only for a moment. Yet Anthony noticed. He always noticed now. The hesitation. The tiny disappointment. The quick glance toward other children and their fathers. The emotions they tried so hard to hide. His jaw tightened. Then something happened. Something completely unexpected. The principal spotted him. Oh. The older woman looked delighted. Mr. Green. Anthony immediately regretted everything. Because now hiding in the parking lot was no longer an option. Several people turned. Teachers smiled. Parents whispered. The principal waved enthusiastically. Far too enthusiastically. And suddenly 3 familiar children looked his way. Damien froze. Then exploded. Investment men. Every head on the field turned. Anthony closed his eyes briefly. Of course. Of course that happened. The little boy immediately sprinted toward him. Followed by Diana. Followed by Daniel. Followed by Daisy. Who looked horrified. Minutes later, Anthony found himself standing beside the triplets again. An increasingly common problem. We didn't know you were coming. Diana sounded genuinely happy. Anthony smiled. Neither did I. Technically true. Damien pointed dramatically. Good. Anthony raised an eyebrow. Why? The little boy looked offended by the question. Because we need one more person. Silence. Dangerous silence. Anthony immediately became suspicious. What kind of person? Damien grinned. The grin of a child about to ruin someone's afternoon. A relay race person. No. Please. No. Please. No. Diana joined the attack. Then Daniel. Even Daisy looked like she was trying not to smile. Anthony realized with growing horror that he was being outnumbered. Severely. A few minutes later, he found himself standing at the starting line. Holding a relay baton. Surrounded by children. His dignity nowhere to be found. The race began. Chaos followed. Mostly because Damien interpreted every rule as a suggestion. Yet somehow they were winning. Barely. At one point Anthony glanced toward the little boy. Their eyes met. Both grinned. The exact same grin. For the exact same moment. Several teachers noticed. Several parents noticed. And one person noticed more than anyone else. Daisy. Her smile slowly faded. Because suddenly, Daniel's words returned. He looks like Damien. The thought settled heavily inside her chest. Not as certainty. Not as belief. Just as a question. A dangerous question. One she couldn't seem to dismiss anymore. And somewhere deep inside Anthony Green, that same question was beginning to grow. Louder. Stronger. More impossible to ignore. The truth was getting closer. And neither of them were ready for what came next. Proof. Anthony Green had spent 15 years believing he was sterile. 15 years. The number haunted him now. 15 birthdays. 15 Christmases. 15 years of watching friends become fathers. 15 years of family gatherings where relatives lowered their voices whenever children were mentioned. 15 years of pity. Of humiliation. Of loneliness. Of slowly accepting a future he had never wanted. At first, he had fought. He had visited specialist after specialist. Hospital after hospital. Country after country. Each new doctor brought fresh hope. Each new result crushed it. Eventually, hope became exhausting. So he stopped fighting. Stopped dreaming. Stopped imagining little footsteps running through his house. Stopped imagining tiny hands grabbing his fingers. Stopped imagining children calling him dad. The dreams had hurt too much. Now someone was telling him those 15 years might have been built on a lie. And Anthony was done guessing. He wanted proof. The decision to order a DNA test should have terrified him. Instead, it felt inevitable. Like fate had finally dragged him to a door he could no longer avoid. For weeks he had ignored the signs. The missing clinic records. The altered diagnoses. The donor mix-up. The triplets. Especially the triplets. Every road somehow led back to them. Back to Daniel. Back to Diana. Back to Damien. 3 children who had somehow invaded his thoughts without permission. 3 children who felt strangely important. 3 children he couldn't explain. Across town, Daisy was trying to enjoy a peaceful Saturday. A mistake. Peace never lasted long around the Hart triplets. Especially Damien. The 6-year-old had somehow convinced several neighborhood children to attend what he called an executive tea party. Nobody knew what that meant. Including Daisy. Yet somehow 20 people had shown up. The garden was full of laughter. Children ran between, parents chatted nearby. Daniel was organizing activities. Diana was helping younger children. And Damien had appointed himself CEO. Naturally. Some things never changed. Watching them, Daisy smiled. Moments like this reminded her why every sacrifice had been worth it. Every sleepless night. Every struggle. Every tear. Her children were happy. That was enough. Or at least it should have been. Because lately, a certain man kept finding his way into her thoughts. Anthony Green. The similarities. The questions. The strange connection between him and the children. The way Diana immediately trusted him. The way Daniel studied him. The way Damien acted like they'd known each other forever. None of it made sense. Yet she couldn't seem to stop thinking about it. Several houses away, Anthony sat inside a parked vehicle. Watching. Waiting. Thinking. His investigator sat beside him. Looking mildly concerned. "You're sure about this?" Anthony nodded. "Yes." The investigator sighed. "I've worked for some strange clients." Anthony ignored him. His gaze remained fixed on the children playing in the garden. The children who might change everything. The children who might answer questions he'd carried for 15 years. Or destroy what little piece he had left. Then opportunity appeared. Simple. Unexpected. Dangerous. Damien abandoned a water bottle after chasing a football. Daniel left behind a plastic cup. Diana tossed away a juice box. Normal childhood behavior. Life-changing evidence. The investigator quietly collected them. Neither man spoke. Because both understood what this meant. There would be no more guessing after this. No more theories. No more possibilities. Only truth. And truth had a way of destroying lives. That evening, Anthony personally delivered the samples to a private laboratory. No assistants. No lawyers. No intermediaries. This mattered too much. The technician reviewed the paperwork. Then looked up. You want paternity testing? Anthony's throat tightened. The words felt unreal. Almost absurd. Paternity. A word he'd never expected to hear connected to himself. Not after 15 years. Not after countless diagnoses. Not after building an entire life around infertility. Yet here he was. Yes. The technician nodded. Results within 48 hours. 48 hours. Anthony suddenly hated time. The waiting was torture. Every minute stretched endlessly. Every hour felt longer than the last. Sleep became impossible. Work became impossible. Concentration became impossible. His mind kept returning to the same question. What if? What if Martha was right? What if the records had been altered? What if the diagnosis was fake? What if someone had stolen 15 years from him? The thought filled him with rage. Because those years couldn't be returned. They couldn't be recovered. They couldn't be relived. They were simply gone. Stolen. Meanwhile, Martha N. George sat alone in her apartment. Watching the rain outside. Waiting. For weeks she had carried the burden alone. Now the truth was finally moving. Finally breathing. Finally fighting its way into the light. Soon Anthony would know. Soon everything would change. And once the truth arrived, nobody would be able to stop it. 48 hours later, Anthony's phone rang. The laboratory. His entire body went still. The office suddenly felt too quiet. Too small. Too warm. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. For several seconds, he simply stared at the screen. Unable to move. Because deep down, he understood something. The men who answered this call would not be the same men who ended it. Slowly. Very slowly. Anthony reached for the phone. And pressed answer. The truth was finally here. The results. The laboratory technician was speaking. But the words felt distant. Muffled. As though coming from underwater. His hand tightened around the phone. Mr. Green. Anthony forced himself to focus. Yes. The technician hesitated. Professional. Careful. Almost nervous. Which immediately terrified him. Because laboratory professionals weren't supposed to sound nervous. Not unless something significant had happened. Mr. Green, we've completed the analysis. His heart pounded. Hard. Painfully hard. The office suddenly felt too small. Too quiet. Too warm. Everything narrowed to a single moment. A single answer. A single truth. 15 years of questions. 15 years of grief. 15 years of believing he would never hear the words he desperately wanted. Or feared. Tell me. Silence. Then. The probability of paternity is 99.9999%. The world stopped. Completely. Anthony stared at the city beyond his office windows. Unable to move. Unable to speak. Unable to process what he'd just heard. The technician continued. The children are biologically yours. Nothing. No reaction. No sound. No movement. Just silence. Pure. Absolute silence. Because Anthony Green had spent 15 years believing he could never father children. And now someone was telling him he had 3. Not 1. 3. Mr. Green. The technician sounded concerned. Anthony finally blinked. The city came back into focus. The office returned. Reality returned. But nothing looked the same anymore. Say it again. His voice barely worked. The technician repeated it. Patiently. Clearly. The children are biologically yours. Anthony closed his eyes. A strange sound escaped him. Half laugh. Half sob. Entirely broken. Because suddenly 15 years crashed into him all at once. The hospital visits. The specialists. The diagnoses. The pity. The humiliation. The lonely nights. The relationships that ended. The future he'd buried. Everything. All of it. A lie. A massive, cruel, unforgivable lie. His knees nearly gave out. Anthony sank into his chair. One hand covering his mouth. The other gripping the edge of the desk. 3 children. Daniel. Diana. Damien. His children. His son. His daughter. His son. The words echoed endlessly. His children. His. A tear slipped down his cheek. Then another. Then another. Anthony didn't stop them. For 15 years he'd trained himself not to hope. Now hope had returned all at once. Violent. Overwhelming. Impossible to control. The call ended eventually. Anthony couldn't remember how. He simply sat there. Alone. Staring. Thinking. Feeling. Then suddenly he stood. His chair crashed backward. The sound echoed through the office. He didn't care. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't care about anything except one thing. His children. A knock sounded. His assistant entered. Then froze. Immediately. Because Anthony Green was crying. She had worked for him for 7 years. She had never seen him cry. Not once. Not ever. Sir. Anthony looked up. His eyes were red. His hands shaking. His entire world shattered. And rebuilt. Within a single phone call. They're mine. The words came out broken. Barely audible. What? Anthony laughed. Then cried again. Then laughed. The reaction frightened her. Sir. They're mine. This time louder. Stronger. More certain. His eyes filled again. The children. Understanding slowly dawned. The investigation. The records. The DNA test. The triplets. Her own eyes widened. Oh my God. Anthony nodded. Exactly. Oh my God. Across the city, Daisy sat on the living room floor helping Diana with a puzzle. Daniel was reading. Damien was attempting to teach a goldfish new tricks. A hopeless endeavor. Yet he remained committed. The afternoon felt peaceful. Ordinary. Beautiful. The kind of moment Daisy treasured. Because motherhood wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was simply this. A puzzle. A book. A stubborn little boy arguing with a fish. She smiled. Completely unaware that everything was about to change. Back inside Green Holdings, Anthony stood before the large window. The DNA report rested in his hand. Proof. Absolute proof. No room for doubt. No room for denial. No room for misunderstanding. The children were his. His children. His family. His blood. And someone had stolen them from him. The realization ignited something dark. Something dangerous. Something furious. For 15 years someone had manipulated his life. Someone had convinced him he was broken. Someone had robbed him of fatherhood. And now they would pay. Every single one of them. Victor Green. The doctors. The clinic employees. Whoever had participated. Whoever had benefited. Whoever had known. They would all pay. Because Anthony Green had just discovered two things. The first was that he was a father. The second was that he was about to become the most dangerous